where you happen to have troops stationed, you're going to be dragged into something that you may want nothing to do with. So this whole business of forward basing needs to go away. Nobody wants to admit that you can't rapidly reinforce across the Pacific and the Atlantic Oceans. There are these things now called submarines. They are the king of warfare at sea. In the Navy, people talk about two kinds of ships in the Navy. One class, submarines, the other class, targets. I mean, things have changed in terms of technology. We don't want to come to terms with that, because if you start recognizing what you cannot do in the future that you did in the past, well, then people say exactly what you did, Dr. Paul. Well, perhaps we don't need X, Y, and Z anymore. And they're right. We don't. We need other things, but that's a different process. And we can get involved with that, but we're not going to get anywhere with the status quo right now. So I think we're going to hang around until we're broke.
I'd like to ask a little bit about the actual preparedness of the military, because you hear a lot about it. Of course, if you had a different foreign policy, the preparedness would be defensive and not in many ways that it is an offensive force. But they're talking about the draft and this sort of thing. First, have you observed with your career and what's going on currently a definite decrease in our ability if we had to fight a truly defensive war? And also, what do you think the significance has to contribute to this problem of preparedness and finding people who want to be in the military by making the military woke?
Well, the first thing is that, remember, most of what the generals and the admirals want is force structure and things. In other words, weapon systems, ships, aircraft, and so forth. They're not thinking in terms of force design. They're not thinking really in terms of capabilities in most cases. They're all engaged in trying to refight some version of the Second World War. So that's problem number one. That's one of the reasons that the top echelons all need to go away, frankly. The second part of it is the wokeness. Well, you can't recruit right now for the Army, and the Marines, they have a different way of doing business, and they are actually actively recruiting large numbers of so-called illegal aliens to serve in their force. But the Army has a different approach, and the Army is now saying, well, if you're not a Christian and you're not a white man, the world is yours. Come to us and we'll give you a job. I think that's also true in the Navy and increasingly in the Air Force. That's not a prescription for success. It may make people temporarily happy in Washington, D.C. They'll point to this and say, see, we've now created this new politically correct, woke military force, but it won't fight well. Its morale is low. Its equipment is old. If we've seen anything in this war in Ukraine, it's the performance of much of the Western equipment, which has its roots in the 1970s and 1980s, hasn't performed very well. But we've squandered, opportunities over decades to make prudent changes. And now you have a force that the people that really need to be there to fight don't want to join. I mean, if you turn to some strapping young man in high school in Texas and Dallas or Austin or somewhere, and you tell him, look, you're fine. We like you. We're great. We're happy that you're a good athlete and did well in school. But see Susie Q over there, who weighs all of 90 or 100 pounds. She can do everything you can do and probably better. Well, if you tell that to young men say, fine, then I don't need to be part of your organization.
That's great. Doug, I listened to a lot of your interviews, and there's something you've been saying recently in a couple of them that I found very fascinating. Because you said earlier on, I really don't know what to do about these problems. I don't know what's happening. You've said in the past that if you look at the different segments of society that we have, they're all really controlled by a certain class of people. You talk about the media and the government, the military-industrial complex, et cetera. For the benefit of our viewers, if they haven't seen you in other circumstances discussing this, could you kind of give us an idea of what you were saying?
No. Do you have any easy questions that you want to go over?
Well, you were talking about the donor class and how they run things,
No, that's right. I talk about this all the time because I've seen it in action. Dr. Paul did. I'm sure you have, Dan. Donors tend to decide most issues. I thought one of the clearest and most depressing examples of this came with Governor DeSantis. He was somewhere campaigning for the presidency, and someone asked him about Ukraine, and he immediately said, well, let's be frank, the United States has no vital strategic interest in Ukraine. We never have. So clearly, I don't think we should be involved in what's happening in Ukraine. Legitimate answer, in my judgment. 2 days later, someone asked him again, well, what do you think about this? You said the last time, you said, well, I spoke hastily. I think we really have to be there. It's about defending democracy. And he repeated all this nonsense that you hear from the mainstream media. And at the time I was asked, well, what has happened? And I said, well, he received some calls from his donors. And the donors are very wealthy people. They control the finance system, the finance sector, much of Wall Street. They control the media. We can talk about how much of academia they influence by putting people into key positions that determine what's going to be taught, what brand of history, what narrative is acceptable, and so forth. These things are disastrous for the United States, because at the end of the day, people begin to figure out finally, well, who represents me? Who cares about the Americans? Why are you listening to these donors? Well, that's because the donors control everything, and they send people to the Hill to write lots of the legislation. I mean, we know that with the pharmaceutical, sector, with the military sector, defense sector. All sorts of people show up and said, well, I can't do this. I can't write this. I need help. We'll send you help. And in come people who write legislation that is favorable for all sorts of reasons to the wrong people. This has been going on for years. This is not working. The government doesn't work. I mean, to be frank, our government was designed in the 1780s by a group of very thoughtful people who frankly thought that we'd be lucky if the whole thing held together for 20 years, at which point in time they anticipated another convention to revisit everything. Well, here we are, hundreds of years later, we're still dealing with this old governmental structure. I think it's kind of reached a point where it's going to become obvious that it simply doesn't work, and we're going to have to go to different systems. I realize that's heresy, but, I really think we're going to get there.
I think the answer you just gave, Daniel, on this is going to apply to what I'm going to ask you, because we're real interested, and I know you have a concern about, the whistleblowers, the people who are on the inside and they know what's going on and they want to tell us the truth. And sometimes they get into a lot of trouble over that. And the whistleblower, the laws that are supposed to protect them, really doesn't. And we, of course, know the story of Ed Snowden. But right now in the news is the story about Assange, who's an Australian citizen. And we just blocked that we were disappointed that Trump didn't do a little bit more to help, like he didn't do much at all. But this to me is so important. But I was wondering if you had any idea why there was a shift in Australia. Was there a new president over there, or just what happened? Because they weren't helpful at all. But in this last 6 months or a year, there seems to be a better attitude by the government of Australia.
Well, first, let's point something out that's so important that it can't be overstated. I know people talk about the Constitution, but as I say, we're going to have to change the way we govern and administer this country in the future. But there's something called the Bill of Rights, and that is sacrosanct. My great disappointment is the failure of members in the House and the Senate to enforce the Bill of Rights. That's the single most important document, in my estimation, in the United States. It sets us apart from everybody. And I can't stress that enough. I would have someone read the Bill of Rights every day over the radio to make sure people understand what it means, because it's the fabric of our lives. And that brings us to somebody like Assange. He has been treated, just as all the others have been, abominably. And I think what happened in Australia is what's happened in Western Europe. You had people come to power in these countries who were aligned with the larger globalist network, and they were funded in many cases by wealthy oligarchs. I call them oligarchs in the West just as they do in the East, because they can insert people into positions all over the country. Look at what Soros has been able to do with attorney generals all across the United States. And I think a lot of money has gone into building these governments that are frankly antithetical to the interests of the people they govern. And Australia was a good example. The Australians are still trying to come to terms with several realities, one of which is that they're too far from Great Britain to be rescued by the British, and they no longer expect that. But at the same time, they've also lost their cultural identity or national identity because of immigration. And there are serious problems inside Australia with immigration. And then finally, there's the United States. We want them to join us in every conceivable crazy scheme that we come up with. And they feel, well, if we don't join the Americans, they may not come and help us when we need it. Look what they did for us during World War II. But again, I think there are more and more people in Australia who are beginning to figure out that's not a reasonable expectation anymore, and that joining us may be a very bad idea. Remember, Harold Macmillan's great achievement as prime minister was to give JFK, Jack Kennedy, very good advice about Southeast Asia, about the Cuban Missile Crisis. He was a voice of reason. But his successors have all turned into little mouthpieces for whatever Washington wanted. And that's the current status right now. I think we're going to have to wait for more bad news before the governments, not just in Australia, but also in Europe, turn over.
Good. Colonel, we're about to run out of time, but Daniel has a question before we finish.
Well, Colonel, first I want to say thanks for giving us some of your time, and we certainly look forward to seeing you in September in D.C., and I'm sure everyone's going to want to get tickets after listening to what you've had to say to our conference and come listen to more of what you have to say. Now, my last question is something that you honestly do not have to answer if you're not comfortable answering, but it took a long time for President Trump to get you in his administration and to benefit from your good advice. Do you think he's learned his lesson? He had a lot of bad people working for him. Do you feel confident he's learned his lesson? Again, don't answer if you don't feel like it, but that's what everyone's sort of wondering.
Well, I think it's a legitimate question, and I have not talked to the president for a long time. He is very deeply embroiled in this legal problem that he's got with the administration and the attempts by the administration to drive him to jail. And I'm very sympathetic to him. I can't imagine any other country in the world behaving this way, certainly not in the Western world, but we do. So you're asking an important question, and I don't know. We'll have to see who else shows up around him. He still keeps people close to him that in many cases I think are not the right ones. But that's a matter for him to decide. I just don't know. I really don't. I would hope so, because the thing that Senator Rand Paul tried to tell the president over and over and over again, which was very right, is that personnel is policy. And the president told me, he said, I should have brought you in earlier, but I didn't know you existed. I heard that from Jeff Sessions and other people. A lot of these political figures don't know who else is out there because they're spoon-fed the answers. And remember, I think President Trump said, well, I'm going to get the best people. And his assumption was, well, if I just go to Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Dartmouth, Stanford, or the service academies, I'm going to get the best. But we've learned over many, many years that the people that come out of those places are, in fact, a big part of the problem. I hope he's figured that out.
Very good. I want to close by, giving you a big thank you for visiting with us today, and we're anxiously waiting for our meeting in September. And if you'd like to say a farewell comment to our listeners, because I'm positive that they appreciate hearing from you, and they'll be anxious to hear you in September.
Well, in September, I want to talk about a few things, one of which is the four horsemen of the apocalypse. And I identify those as being atheism, nihilism, Marxism, and globalism. And those four horses are running all over the West and trampling our civilization beneath their feet. And that's what has to end. And the only people that can do that are us. I mean, if there's one thing I keep trying to tell people over and over and over, well, do you think so-and-so is going to be elected and he will save us? He will lead us out of this. And I keep looking at them and saying, stop looking for someone to save you. Organize, become active. You've got to save yourselves.